So, today we're going to be talking about Mary Bennet. Yes, that middle sister in the Bennet family from Pride and Prejudice. The one who plays the piano at Netherfield and embarrasses the whole family and would totally hit on Collins if he wasn't busy hitting on her other sisters. Yeah. Have you ever wondered, what is Mary Bennet's purpose in the story? Today we're going to be answering those questions by looking at a literary device that Jane Austen used to really help us understand the context and characters in her world. And we're going to see how Mary Bennet is actually essential to the novel and a vital part of her family and how we understand the entire story. Do you like classic literature and history? Well, if so, then let me introduce myself. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about Jane Austen, her characters, and real-life people from the 1700s and 1800s, and what life was actually like. If you like any of those things, please subscribe. So today we're going to be talking a lot about how we as humans perceive reality, which is within context. There are basic underlying psychological factors that connect the way we see visually to the way we perceive other people to how we understand characters and narratives in books. And of course, Jane Austen masterfully used these psychological factors to understand her characters even better in context. So the first literary device is called foils, which is related to this other concept called doppelgängers. If you've studied literature at all, you're probably familiar somewhat with these terms. A foil is a character that an author puts in a story that is usually the opposite in some ways of one of the main characters or a different character. Say you have a main character. Let's take in Pride and Prejudice, for example, Mr. Darcy. He has all of his characteristics. Well, then you have a character who has the opposite characteristics of Mr. Darcy. Well, who's that? It's Mr. Wickham, right? Darcy is proud, Wickham is friendly. Darcy is honest and true, Wickham is deceitful and crafty. But by being the opposite and putting them right next to each other, they highlight even more their characteristics. So for example, Darcy looks better because Wickham's awful. Wickham looks awful because he's not like Darcy. And this is the same concept we see visually with something called complementary colors, which is, of course, if you put two colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel, then they act to make each other pop and really stand out vibrantly. And an opposite character does this for any character in a book. It really highlights different qualities. What's really interesting about this concept is this is something we really do in real life. So I've seen people who've gone through a divorce or a really bad breakup and then now they're in a new relationship. They tend to talk about their new partner in terms of their old partner. Such as, my new boyfriend brought me flowers and they're just so beautiful and he's just so sweet. And that is something my ex would never do. My ex would not even remember our 1-year anniversary. Can you believe that? But this new guy, he's so sweet and he brought me flowers. Now, to highlight the power the foil has on making us appreciate qualities in someone, what if her ex-boyfriend had also just bought her flowers? Then, how would she react? Oh yeah, my new boyfriend, he bought me flowers. They were pretty. He's so sweet. Okay, now, do you see how he went from, he's so sweet, to, he's so sweet? And I think that's the thing is when you have that foil to compare someone to, their qualities become immensely more impactful on you than otherwise. So again, that's just like those complementary colors really making each other's distinct characteristics stand out. And it's also just like Wickham making us really appreciate Mr. Darcy. This is even more true in something called a doppelganger. A doppelganger, which I don't know if I'm saying that correctly in its German form, I think that's where it comes from, but one that shares a lot of common traits with a character, while also being the opposite in other traits, which is again an example with Darcy and Wickham. They grew up together, they're from the same county, they're young men of the same age that have both been introduced into Elizabeth Bennet's company recently. They have all of these shared characteristics, so those shared characteristics highlight even more the difference between them when they are different. So, for example, Mrs. Bennet is really different from Mr. Wickham, but we don't really compare Mrs. Bennet to Mr. Wickham because they don't have enough characteristics in common to make us mentally compare them. But comparing Wickham to Darcy comes extremely naturally because they have so much in common already. But then again, who do we compare Mrs. Bennet to? One person we compare Mrs. Bennet to is Mrs. Gardiner. If only Mrs. Gardiner was Elizabeth's mother, wouldn't her life be so much easier? But then on the other hand, we can also compare Mrs. Bennet to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who is another matriarchal figure in a family in the book. And aren't we all glad that at least Mrs. Bennet isn't in some ways like Lady Catherine? And we really see this again in the Wickham-Darcy relationship. I think their foil is fascinating because it changes over time. It does a complete flip in the middle of the book. So when we first meet Darcy, he's haughty, he's reserved, he doesn't interact with people, he's not outgoing at all. When we meet Wickham, he's the opposite of all of those qualities. He's outgoing, he flirts with Elizabeth, he knows how to flatter and hobnob with everybody. And those are all initially the qualities that they highlight in each other. Darcy comes off to even greater effect for being reserved if you compare him next to Wickham. Now, halfway through the book, the entire thing flips. When Elizabeth gets that letter at Rosings where she discovers that Wickham's secretly a villain, meanwhile Darcy's not that bad of a guy, really. After that point, now Darcy comes out as the better option of the two, and we continue to learn more and more about his great character, while Wickham descends slower into more and more villainy, again highlighting each other's qualities in a different way. And really, if you look at pretty much any book, it's going to be full of these sort of character relationships. And in Pride and Prejudice, we also have Elizabeth Bennet and her foil Charlotte Lucas. And I'm actually going to make a whole other video on that one. And the list goes on and on. Now, a sure way to also identify a foil usually is if there is a love triangle of some sorts. And of course, it's also no mistake that the Wickham-Darcy foil is at the heart of a love triangle of sorts in Pride and Prejudice. We see the exact same thing in Sense and Sensibility, where Willoughby and Colonel Brandon are foils of each other, and they're in a love triangle with Mary Ann. So the next concept I really want to talk about is related to it, and it's called simultaneous contrast, which in graphic design and art, that means that everything you see affects everything else you see. Sort of like if you're wearing really a dark navy shirt that looks black normally, but if you go and you stand in front of something that's truly black, suddenly you can now see that it's navy. Well, how do authors use this to help us understand their characters? One way is if you have a character who might be slightly morally questionable, but if you put characters who are even worse than this guy in the same book, he'll come off looking better compared to them. I think a great example of this is Mr. Thornton in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South. And I want to specifically talk about the miniseries here because it's different from the book in some aspects. In the miniseries, they put the scene in the beginning of it where we see Mr. Thornton beating up this poor guy. And everyone's like, Mr. Thornton must not be that great of a guy. He beats up poor people. So how do you reverse this? Because he's supposed to be the hero and main love interest of this show. How do you get people to like him? One of the answers is to put characters even worse than him in the story so that he, by contrast, will look better, which is exactly what all the other heartless, money-grubbing mill owners that he goes out to dinner with do. They make him look better, which again just goes to show that we understand characters in relation to the other characters of the same story versus perhaps our knowledge of humanity in general. I want to talk about one more concept of how we perceive things before we really get into why Mary Bennet is so important in Pride and Prejudice. And this one is that as humans, we like the middle option. If you've ever been shopping online for maybe software, website hosting, or even photography packages, usually if the person's a smart business person, they'll give you at least 3 options of different price points, different packages, different options, whatever it is. And here's the true secret about that. They want you to pick the middle one. In fact, their business model is based off you picking the middle option. They'd love if you bought the most expensive thing, but they're not counting on that. And they also know that people generally don't like the cheapest thing either. People are psychologically driven to choose the middle ground, which do, if you look at those pages, usually around one of the middle ones is always like best value or most popular. That's an added psychological drive for you to do the thing you already kind of wanted to do, which was pick the middle one. And this goes back to the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where it was the one that wasn't too big and the one that wasn't too small that's just right. People tend to not like extremes and things. They prefer to stay in the balanced, safe zone of the middle. Now, what does this have to do with Pride and Prejudice? Well, we're going to take all of these factors and show how this proves Mary Bennet is essential to how we understand Pride and Prejudice. In the Bennet family, we have 5 daughters, and they're paired very interestingly. We have the 2 youngest, of course, Lydia and Kitty, who are always running after officers and being rather silly. Then we have Jane and Elizabeth, who are grouped off too as best friends, who we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's Mary Bennet, who is self-righteous. She doesn't like to go out other than to show her poor piano skills off. Basically, Mary Bennet is a foil of her sisters, but the sisters that she is foiling the most are her exact opposites, which are Kitty and Lydia Bennet. So on one side we have Mary Bennet being the extreme of reserve and self-righteousness and strict morality. And then on the other side we have Lydia and Kitty, who they're gonna run around, do what they want. They're incredibly indulgent, and they're holding down 2 extremes. Now, what did we just learn about people wanting to pick the thing in the middle? Well, who is in between being extremely self-indulgent and being incredibly self-righteous and strict? Jane and Elizabeth Bennet. They walk this line of being women of virtue and yet at the same time not being overly self-righteous and strict like Mary over here. Meanwhile, they're much more conservative than Kitty and Lydia. On a spectrum of this family's characteristics, Elizabeth and Jane are in the middle, which leads us psychologically to like them the most. They present that perfect middle balanced option. Now, what would the family look like if Mary didn't exist? If for some reason Jane Austen was like, there's only 4 sisters in this family. Well, then instead of Mary holding down one end of this extreme spectrum, suddenly, if she drops off, you have Jane and Elizabeth holding down one extreme and being the new opposite of Mary and Kitty, which is a lot less satisfying to us mentally because they're no longer the balanced middle. They've become one extreme of this polar opposite. Or if we take the opposite view and we have Kitty and Lydia drop off, then we would have Mary on one end, and we'd have Elizabeth Jane on the other end. They would suddenly look a lot more indulgent compared to Mary because there's no other end of the spectrum showing that they are actually a good, balanced couple of women. Now, for example, we see this sort of same foil structure, I think, with Mr. Darcy. Obviously, on one side of the extreme, we have Mr. Wickham, then we have Mr. Darcy. Then I think we have Mr. Bingley. I think Bingley holds down the other end of the spectrum for Mr. Darcy to be this nice balance between 2 of them. Which, interestingly, I think this explains something in Mansfield Park. A lot of people don't like the main heroine of Mansfield Park, Fanny Price. In fact, a lot of people love the sort of villainess of Miss Crawford. Now, the big question is why? Because Fanny and Mary Crawford are definitely foils of each other. But if we take Fanny's cousins, the Miss Bertrams, into the picture, I feel like what we start to see is this choosing the middle conundrum, where Fanny holds down the place that Mary Bennet does in Pride and Prejudice. She's the extreme conservative. I think Mary Crawford comes off as being in the center because she knows it's the wisest course. And then we have Fanny's cousins, the Miss Bertrams, holding down the more liberal side of things, which puts, again, Mary Crawford in the center. Meanwhile, Mary Crawford is also, I feel like, in the center on the deep thinking, intelligence, level of all of these women too. So basically, Mary Crawford is living in the space that Elizabeth Bennet lives in Pride and Prejudice, psychologically that is, which makes sense because a lot of people have compared her to Elizabeth Bennet over the years. So this, I think, is what really adds to the problem of people liking Mary better than they like Fanny, because Fanny's holding down one end of an extreme. Now, how could have Jane Austen fixed this if she wanted to? She could have introduced a character that pushed Fanny into the center. If there was a character who was more rigid, who was extra strict, who was impossibly self-righteous, who could have been even more conservative than Fanny on the spectrum, it would have pushed her into the center. Then you would have had 4 options, but at least Fanny would have been one of the middle options to choose. Of course, Jane Austen did not do that. She left Fanny at one extreme, which I think is part of the reason a lot of people don't like Fanny. So to sum this all up, why is Mary Bennet so important in Pride and Prejudice? Well, she helps us understand her whole family and especially her sisters within context. She holds down the super conservative end of the spectrum so that Elizabeth and Jane can be in the center and our brains will inherently like them more. And she highlights just how crazy Kitty and Lydia are, and she highlights Elizabeth and Jane's more balanced view of things. In fact, the whole way we would see the characters in Pride and Prejudice would be altered if she had simply been left out of the story. Also, she's there to embarrass her family at the Netherfield Ball, and I mean, that is an essential job right there. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this random ramblings on literary devices and Jane Austen's works, and I hope you have an awesome day, because you're awesome. Bye! I need to record this. This is my white balance card.